Fred, thank you very much for introducing me. I appreciate it. That was very kind, more kind than necessary. And I should also like to thank Deborah very much and Billy for the music. I had thought maybe we could have something along the lines of Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson, but I think this wowed us a little bit more. Really fun. The reason I'm here is, most of you should know, is that Fred saw Ella, my wife, dance and heard her talk in India and asked her to come to this thing. And Ella asked if I'd be interested in coming, and I said, sure. And then Fred, I think he saw a freebie here, and asked me if I'd like to talk, and I said I'd be glad to. So that's the long and short of it. That's the phrase, almost. Yeah, I am going to talk to you about Seclusion Hill and about some other things, but the only way I think that might make sense in terms of Seclusion Hill is to tell you something of what happened before. I heard, I've taken up golf. That's knocking these spheres, as you know, from one end of a piece of land to a little hole, and I'm enjoying it. And on these golf courses, you meet all kinds of people. One of them told me the other day about a friend's wife who had Alzheimer's and went to see the doctor who was giving her medicine to help her memory, help the synapses click, click, click. And she went to the doctor and said, "Doctor, I wonder if you could prescribe that medication again." And he said, "What medication was that?" And she said, "The medication for my memory." And he said, "Oh, yes. Frankly, I've forgotten what that is. Tell me, what is it that grows and it has thorns and a flower on the end? A rose? That's right, rose. Rose, what is that medication I gave to... Memory doesn't always work very well. I've taken, since my retirement, to scribbling words. And I find that memory is not a very good source for data. I do know that I was told that I was conceived in 1927, probably December, and was born on August 5th, 1928. Now I have searched, and I can assure you that that date, August 5th, 1928, is fraught and pregnant with insignificance. That's the beginning of my spiritual journey. A whack on the behind. My parents divorced within a year of my birth, so I didn't have a father. I had a grandfather, wonderful chap, wonderful man, and I had an uncle who was really a cousin, you know. He just died. In first grade, I'm told that in first grade I was asked what I would like to be. And that's very important. What we do, it has nothing to do with who we are, but very important. Do, what am I going to do? And what I'd like to be. And I said, I want to be a minister, before I realized the 3 orders of ministry in the Episcopal Church of bishop, priest, and deacon, and or a surgeon in the United States Navy. Well, lo and behold, I did become a priest. And lo and behold, I don't know why, it's just for fun, but I have a son now who's studying, he's in the Navy, and he's studying to be a surgeon. So,
his name's Peter.
And his name is Peter. That's right. Thank you. Things grew, in time, I began to realize that the reason I became a priest was that if I didn't have a father, I would become a father, my own father, in a sense. And a shrink didn't tell me that. I realized it. And then, thank God, I became a father in terms of flesh and blood. And I can't tell you how very proud I am of each of my children. It's an extraordinary thing. I reflect on that once in a while. I have no idea why that gift has been given, but it has. And I give you a bio of each of them, but we don't have the time. And then now let me go on a little bit. You want to hear about Baba? When I was in grammar school, my dear friend Sandy Valentine's mother had aspirations to be an opera star. And she was also in the choir of the Episcopal Church and thought I might do well there. And that's how I got associated with the Episcopal Church. I was baptized a Swedish Lutheran. I'm talking about religion now, and not necessarily spirituality, but they do conclude or come together from time to commingle. Well, I got into the choir and became very active in the Episcopal Church. I had all kinds of happy times. The rector was something of a father figure, and I discovered in my life, as in yours, I'm sure, all of us have many father figures, many mother figures, if we think, or if we reflect. And the more we reflect on it, the happier we get, because we realize, my God, this is free. This is a wonderful gift. We can choose some of our parents instead of having them choose us. My heroes were Mohandas Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My enemies and hate objects, of course, were in those days Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. The times in which I was brought up were glorious times in terms of our country, in terms of the wholeness and the oneness. Well, anyway, I got into college, and there I interviewed a fellow named Stephen Spender, who was we started a radio station, a friend of mine and I, and we interviewed speakers. Stephen Spender came up, and I learned something that I didn't like at all. There's a poet named Ezra Pound, I guess most of you have heard of him. And he was sent to jail as a traitor, not to jail, but to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And in those days, various writers, Penn and others, were either wanting to get him out in respect for his greatness as a poet, out of the hospital. And I interviewed Mr. Spender, who's still alive, I'm told. I read about him once in a while. And he took a very definite view on whether or not to sign the manifesto to free Ezra Pound. And then, I won't tell you which side he took, but for political reasons, He then wrote and asked us to destroy the wire, the tape. He didn't want to go public with his view. And that, to me, was a very curious thing for a poet to do. You either stand for something, damn it, or you don't. And I suppose there are times when it takes, we change because of good reason, but this seemed to be very political. Also in college, I was, as many of you, I'm sure, big people on campus kinds of things. And then in my senior year, along came a man named Reinhold Niebuhr. Do any of you familiar with Reinhold Niebuhr? A few, good. One of the great Protestant theologians that this country has produced. He had a machine gun delivery. I had started a United World Federalist chapter in Hobart, and he had signed a manifesto for world government. This is in the 1940s. I challenged him from the floor because he said something which was very against world government. And I said, my God. And Dr. Niebuhr, in a staccato, machine gun-like delivery, helped me feel as if I could get under the varnish of the floor. I'd be fortunate. He talk about ego displacement. That was ego destruction. And then I began immediately to do something I hadn't done in many years, and that was to pray. And I began to pray. Began to pray to God. And shortly, this is my senior year, we're talking now December, January. I had thought about becoming a minister, as I said, and had put the pro forma stuff in, but I decided really not to apply to seminary. And this was very late. So I applied to seminary, General Theological Seminary in New York, and out of the blue, they accepted me. Usually you have to do it the spring before. Well, that was a happy surprise. However, meanwhile, not to be drafted, I enlisted in the Marine Corps platoon leaders class as a second lieutenant, grunt, infantry. And I had gone for training and so forth, and I really knew how to kill a person easy, as you do in the Marines. And I was on my way now to seminary. And I told the Marines I would go in as an ensign junior grade chaplain. After seminary, I'd give them 3 or 4 years, whatever it was. They didn't want it. It was time of Korea. And they refused. So, lo and behold, I went to Quantico, Virginia. Meanwhile, I had been very active in civil rights and so forth. And on my way to Quantico, this was for active duty, in my second trip, I guess, I was on the train, and we got to Washington, D.C., and they said, I was in my uniform, it was wonderful, a little thing here, and I was officer in the United States Marine Corps. Very impressive. And the conductor came by and he said, I'm sorry, sir, you're going to have to move. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, this is a Jim Crow car. This is 1950, or 49, I forgot. And I said, well, I'm not going to move. I was filled with patriotism, and I'm an arrogant son of a gun anyway. And I was going over possibly to die for my country, and they want me to move because of Jim Crow. Then Jim Crow is, ugh. So I said no. So they sent me a trainman who happened to be an African American. He said, please, sir, move, because if you don't move, you're going to cause all kinds of trouble. And I said, well, I'm not going to move. And of course, they moved everybody out of that car except me. I was involved for many years in civil rights, Jim Farmer and Corps and all kinds of stuff. And I was very blessed to be there in 63 when Dr. King made his speech, and so on and so forth. Well, I got to the Marines at Quantico. This is still about the spiritual journey. And instead of a 45, which I found was not very accurate, it's good for close work, but if you really want to protect yourself, you need a 38. So I had ordered a 38 because I was going overseas, and close contact, you want to make sure that you're okay. They were giving in the afternoon, or in the morning, I'm sorry, a lecture on how to interrogate a prisoner. And I won't tell you what was suggested. Some of you here veterans probably know. And my sense, again being arrogant and naive and so on, I stood up and I said, well, what's the point of our fighting a war if we do not go by the Geneva Convention? And there was a break, and after the break, a light colonel, somebody came out, and Major said, Lieutenant Marx is absolutely correct. We always abide by the Geneva Convention when we interrogate prisoners, always. And many other things. I was at they had all the officers in the Marine Corps at this huge drome, would you believe this, with armed guards in Quantico, Virginia. And the lecture was preventive war. Now was the time to attack the Soviet Union and destroy them, because we still had the edge. Very serious about this. They had armed guards right in Quantico for everything. So, but anyway, so it goes. That afternoon, after the business with the prisoners, a telegram came for me from the Secretary of the Navy asking if I would like to resign my commission. Had nothing to do with my question or anything else. Unbeknownst to me, I had become a test case. And Rabbi Wise, who was a very wonderful rabbi in New York, and Cardinal Spellman, Roman Catholic primate, and Bishop Donegan, my own Donegan, had made me a test case. If a young man wants to be a priest or a rabbi or something, he should have that possibility and not. Well, at any rate, I said yes, went to seminary. And there I met urban priests, people who work with the kind of people that I feel comfortable with, very poor people, people who are, and I suppose that's part of the feeling I had, but I don't know. And we began to, after seminary, well, let me tell you the most important thing that happened to me in seminary. So I met Ella. She told you about her cousin, who was more or less her custodian or chaperone. And we became engaged, and she liked to go to very nice places, and I was a pauper. We did go to a very nice place once, and she didn't see me for many weeks after that. And which, any of you remember Needix in New York City? Well, we went to Needix, and here this naive, silly fellow took her to Needix, and we sat down at the counter, and I suggested we say grace, which we did. But I don't want to, this is foolishness. We married and spent the, that's when I met, now we'll get into the meat of it that interests you. That's when I met Margaret Krask, 1952. Ella and I were working in Jersey City, referred to by some as the armpit of New Jersey. A wonderful place. We loved it. And in New Jersey, what we did, we urban priests took our cue from a man named Abbe Michonneau, who was a French abbot who, after the war, suggested Roman Catholic priests go with the people and work in industry and factories and so forth. And he was very successful. And one of the things they did, which we did, was you live right, of course, where the poor people live, which we did. The poor people, isn't that sick to begin with? But at any rate, where poor people live, you have the same kind of income they have. Your rectory or vicarage or whatever it is open to anybody at any time of day or night. It was a wonderful, happy, happy life. There was in Jersey City a former Roman Catholic priest. His name was Father Alforano. And a priest and his wife, Paul Moore and Jenny, were having and this is sort of fun, remember this, you married people. They were having an argument, and Father Alforano, his persuasion was shaken by this, and he stood up at the table and he said, "No, no, no, no! You are one flesh!" It's one flesh. "Do not, you are one," said he. Well, we worked in Spanish Harlem, had very happy, wonderful times. We worked in the Lower East Side, New York, had happy, wonderful times. You gave your life morning, noon, and night. There was no surcease. And it was happy, joyful. That's the idea of being a conduit, as a friend of yours, Fred, that I was talking to the other day, Bill, whose dear companion died of AIDS a few days ago, or March. He said, my friend had become a conduit. He was not the recipient of God's love, he was a conduit of it. And that's the kind of thing that we were trying to do. Well, then it got to the point where we just don't have the time to relate wonderful adventures we had. We went from the Lower East Side to Yonkers, to a former orphanage. It used to be where the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, some of you may know where that is. It was called Leake and Watts Orphanage. And they took it up to Yonkers, and it became a residential treatment center. And we've had time up there when I went back to graduate school. And then we went back to New York, and I was working on my doctorate, and which I never got. I have 3 degrees and a licentiate, but I never got my doctorate. Isn't that terrible? Went back to New York. Fellow vicar I worked for lied to me about a job, and at the end of the year that we were out of work. I'd never been out of work before. He said that he was going to wait, but he hired somebody else before. So, very, very tough time. I'm sure some of you know what it is to be out of work and have no money. And I had children. That made it even worse. So we left there finally and ended up at the Church of the Holy Communion in Mahopac, New York. Alexandra had been born at Leake and Watts. Peter was born at Holy Communion in Mahopac. And Susan was born at Mount Kisco Hospital. Mahopac was an interesting place. It was composed of Jewish people, Italian Roman Catholic people, and WASPs. And in the 1930s, there was a sign on the Mayapak Hospital which said, "No dogs or Jews allowed." When we arrived in 1960, things had come fairly well because each group realized that the other group could mess it up for their group, and so you had sort of a very fine educational system and it worked out pretty well. Well, the 60s, of course, was a time of great spiritual upheaval. Civil rights, Vietnam, sexual revolution, and a lot was gained, and also a lot was perverted. I won't go through that. Let's talk now a little bit about the 60s and Miss Crask. Pardon me?
When you met Bob.
Oh yes, that was in '56. Good point. I've met Miss Crask numbers of times, and in the '56, Ella and Miss Crask wanted me to meet Baba. And I was neutral. Okay, I'd be glad to meet him. Now you must remember I graduated from seminary in '53, and just being 2 or 3 years out of seminary, I knew everything. So that was a great help, meeting Baba. And I was also deeply involved in working in the Lower East Side at that time. And to take time out to meet Baba was, took time, but I was happy to do it. I admired Miss Crask immensely, and we'll tell you a little bit about admiring her more later. So yes, went to Delmonico Hotel, and yes, some people did rush. I was wearing my clericals, a young priest, my collar and black and that kind of thing. And people rushed up and did pin things on me and stick things on me. And I did feel uncomfortable.
You didn't?
I did. I felt uncomfortable. And I felt that these people were a little unusual. I'm sure they looked at me and had the same feeling. And then we went through the line in which Baba was giving prasad. And behind Baba, as I walked into the room, I saw these two big guys. And this little man is sitting here and he's giving out stuff. He's great big. So I much later found out that was a man named Erich and another man named Adi. And I went through the line. I certainly had heard about him and had respect for him as a holy man, but was not very impressed. He gave me, I believe it was either, Ella thinks it was a grape or a rose petal, and that was about the long and short of it. That was my first contact with Baba.
Did you read it?
Yes. Oh, yes. All right, now let's get into the heart of things a little bit. Then the 60s, that's right.
Peter, did you feel like this was something special?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. Tell me what you came around here. Like.
Oh, they look like Mafia. Dark suits, very stern, arms crossed, to me quite forbidding.
Bullets just along.
That's right, bullet, yes sir, I like it. And muscles Adi. In the 60s, Miss Krask would come up by train to Brewster to visit Ella and me and the children. And after the visit, I would invariably drive her back to New York City, where she lived, as you know, in the Wellington Hotel. And that's when I really got to know Miss Krask, was on the drives back to New York. And she was remarkable in that her intelligence was almost invariably incisive. She had a creamy and delicious wit, and we sort of fed off each other. She was a very feminine woman, and she, even in her 90s, was something of a flirt, or at least with me. And I enjoyed it, and she did. And she was also a person of immense character and immense compassion. And she was very concerned, naturally, not unusually, but naturally, with her Ella. And Ella, she was Ella's mentor. And driving back in the car, we would talk about many things, and a couple of the things, Ella, were about you, actually. But it was she through whom I began to get really interested in Baba. Toward the end of the 60s, we had built a new church. I had been on civil rights marches and protests in Vietnam and the whole business, and had so many other people, and I was tired, and I was also beginning to drink toward the end of the 60s. We had built a new parish house, built a new church building. I remember another great disappointment was during Vietnam, 65, I called up Ottinger, my congressman, and I said, what is going on in terms of bombing Hanoi? And he put his AA, his administrative aide on, who bent my ear for almost 50 minutes, saying it was a good thing to do. And there, my support, of course, went away. I was no longer pro-Vietnam. But why did I tell you that? Tired, very tired.
Half the congregation walking out when you prayed.
Oh yes, we prayed in church for the dead, those killed, Americans and Vietnamese. And when I said we're going to pray for the Vietnamese, 2 or 3 people got up and walked out.
And also,
And
remember when Martin Luther King was killed?
oh yes, well yeah. That's right. When Dr. King was killed, I had to teach the congregation how to sing "We Shall Overcome," and that was sort of an embarrassment to me. But at any rate, I was an arrogant fellow who wasn't making as much money as I should, and all kinds of things. I was disappointed in the church, and I left and went with what I thought would be the saving grace of social action, namely the federal government. And it turned out I was wrong. But went with Vista, and then we became Peace Corps and so forth. At that point, I said, the hell with the church and religion. It doesn't really cut the mustard. We've got people suffering and the church doesn't care. You must remember that this is my ego talking and my arrogance. And well, possibly some right too, sure. Then I went to a Good Friday service after we'd moved to Boston. There I saw literally little old ladies and some chap preaching. And I felt so sad. I said, is this what the Church of God is about? To myself. And I left. And I didn't go back for some time. I took up, I had to remove one of my program officers, which was a very, very stressful, horrible thing to do. It was a woman, and the woman was an African American, and she was incompetent. And shortly after that, I had my first bypass. And then I got into yoga. And I had a yoga instructor who was my personal instructor for 5 years, talking about the asanas, the movements. And then every week for 5, and I did that every day, of course. And then I came under the influence of a man named Dr. Arya, who taught Sanskrit at the University of Minnesota. And he was a very holy and good man. And I began to learn the meditations, and I began to become deeply involved in yoga, which I did for 5 years. Met a man named Swami Rama in Philadelphia. And I was not impressed by him either. And it turns out that just as well, he's been indicted. Then I began to think more and more and read more and more about Baba. Meher Baba. Merwin Shariar Irani. And compassionate father. Well, that something which very deeply in me, I suppose, resonated. I needed a compassionate father very much. Or even a non-compassionate father, I don't care. But compassionate was much better. But the more I did read about him, the more convinced I became that the man was not a fake. He was not a charlatan. He did not ask for money. In my own training, I had 4 years of pretty intense theological training. And those, in my training, my theological training, there's not one false note in his writings that I could see theologically. Don't always agree, but that's not the point. There's nothing fake there. Here is a real holy man, a true person. I wasn't looking for a holy man or true. I had Jesus. And I'll tell you, I loved Jesus so deeply when in the Spanish Harlem and Lower East Side and all over. Just a wonderful person. And what this person claimed to be Jesus, well, that didn't bother me. And I became more and more involved in reading. And then we went to Myrtle Beach from time to time to these meetings or just retreats. And that was not unpleasant, as our English cousins would put it. Not at all unpleasant. And then I decided that something in '86, at about 4 in the morning, I sort of woke and I heard these words. And the words were absolutely clear, crystalline, without inflection. They were not loud, they were not, and I don't know if they were auditory or what, but it was the most clean, pure, absolute words I had ever heard. And the words were, the purpose of life is union with God. Now, sages and holy people over the ages have heard this and said it. Nothing new, but it was for me. So then I had been studying a great deal and reading in yoga at this time. I had also been given gifts of all kinds of occult and silly sensations, enjoying the bouquet of lavender and of lilacs in the middle of winter, and all kinds of silly things, and then all kinds, of course, of coincidences which happened. Well, I went down to see Margaret on my own, and Buzz remembers my coming and opening the door for me. There he is. It's right, which I don't remember, and he's kept a journal, which is wonderful because I'm going to refer back to it. And I got to know Kitty very well. And all right, let's go to the close. I'm sorry. Well, it's supper time. It's supper time. My daughter just said. What's that?
15 minutes. 15 minutes.
Okay.
Don't forget Seclusion Hill.
No. All right. Saw Margaret, Miss Krask. It was Miss Krask until she suggested I call her Margaret. On the porch when she was living in Del Ruby. And I said, I didn't want to tire her. So I said to myself, 1 hour. And so we met. I went down for a few days, or maybe it was, I don't know how long. But Buzz is going to tell me. And we'd go out on the porch and talk for that hour. About all kinds of things, not only Baba. And it was, yes, and then later she went to Happy House. And I visited her there on my own, and also sometimes with Ella. And we got to know each other quite well. And she would indeed put a little bow in her hair when I would come. And we just liked each other. There's something very wonderful there. It's hard to explain. Then decided to go to India. When I was a little boy, I had always wanted to go to Kashmir. I don't know why. No idea. And in '87, so Ella and I went to Paris, and it is true they serve marvelous food. And we enjoyed it to the hilt. Ella realized she can do Remy Martins till they're coming out of her ears, and she'll wake up in the morning, nothing. Nothing. I don't know how she did it, but it's true. Then we did the usual traveler things, went up to the top of Notre Dame and went to the top of the Eiffel Tower. Ella didn't want to go to the top. I don't know why, but I did, and I realized how flat Paris is except for Montmartre. And we had a grand time. Yeah, she understands. Then we went on to Bombay. When I first arrived in Ahmednagar, there are so many fun stories, but when we first arrived in Meherabad and Marazad, particularly Marazad, I was absolutely enthralled, amazed, and delighted, because these people, Erich and Mani and Bao and all the rest, this must obviously be what the primitive Christian church was like. My God, the innocence, the joy, the complete lack of ego, the purity of it all, overwhelming. I had the pleasure of getting to know, and as I'm sure we all have, Erich, dear and special man to me, and Mani. I remember once Erich asked me for a blessing. So I gave him a blessing, made the sign of the cross on his forehead and said appropriate words. And we were both very happy about that. Within minutes, Mani rushed in and said, "I want a blessing too!" so delighted to share that with him. But it was that kind, and then the stories that Erich would tell. And then I had the pleasure of bathing the must Muhammad twice. That was an unusual experience. And there are numbers of experiences, and I'll tell you 3, and I'll end with the hill. One, we had tea with Meru. Susan was with me, and Ella, and we went into Meru's. I don't know if you've been to her home. It's simply one room and a light, overhead light. She served us a wonderful tea, and we talked. And at one point, she said, "Do you believe that Baba's God?" I said, "Well, I don't know. How can I tell?" And the light went out. Now this is true. And she claims that very rarely, if ever, happened. And I stumbled around and I said, "Well, apparently he thought he was, and a lot of people think he was, etc., etc." The light went on again. Then as I approached for the first time the hill, the tomb, as I walked up the hill, and I cannot obviously tell you why, within me I was filled with this: Jesus Christ is risen today, hallelujah, our triumphant holy Lord. Incredible. As I went up, the whole thing just came through me, and I was so happy. It was wonderful. And of course I met Marsari and all the rest. And then, we don't have time. I'm sorry, I'll tell you the story then about the hill. That's not its proper name, by the way, and I've forgotten what it is. Some of you may know. What is it? Tebi, yes. TMBA, Tembe Hill, known as Seclusion Hill. Mary Weiss, Don Mahler, the ballet teacher for the Met. He would always come out to Minnesota when the Met was there. He was a friend of Ella's. A hairdresser from Canada. I've forgotten the lady's name. Marge, right? Thank you. Susan. Ella. A little girl who was the daughter of one of the people who lived there. And me. Anyone else? That was it, wasn't it?
I think that was it.
That was it. What? Yes, that was it, right. Rose! And we went up this hill and made it to the top. And as those of you who have been there know, that down the bottom was hot, languid, overbearing. The top up of the hill was windy. Oh my Lord, I had to hold on to this little girl's hand, literally, so she wouldn't be blown off. And we were up there and went back and forth, and little kids came up from the plane begging money. And I'd gotten to the point where I was a little hard, and I said, "No, back!" or something like that. And they got the point. So we stayed there for a bit, and then the rest of them decided it was about time to go down, at which point this little girl's hat blew off and went over the side. And Susan was going trekking in Nepal, climbing, so she tried to go over the side to get it, and I said, well, I'll get it. She said, no, no, no. And she tried and said, oh my God, don't try, you'll kill yourself, it's ridiculous, it's just a hat. So they went down, and I had some private things to do, I thought, up there, which I did. And I stayed about a half hour. And then I decided to go down. And I saw the hat, and I said, oh, well, I can get that hat. So I went over the side, and I was wearing shoes that my son had given me. And they had little cleats in them and so on. And I went over the side to get the hat, and I fell, and I began to slide. And I was filled with a panic I can't explain. The fear was palpable. And I couldn't, if I'd move a little bit, I would slide more, and there are these ragged rocks way the heck down. And I was frightened beyond any I had ever known. And I said to myself, my Lord, if this is any place you're going to go, this may as well be it. I mean, why not? And I remembered I talked with a friend I had met out there named David. He was a guitarist, former classical guitarist who'd had problems with his hands. And he said, you know, if you ever get in trouble, call Baba's name. And here I was on the edge of what I thought death. Damn hat's there, and I remembered what he said, and my comment to myself was, well, what the hell? What have you got to lose? So I called Baba's name out loud. Baba! And here's the remarkable thing. A peace I have never known since nor before. Absolute, complete peace enveloped me. And concurrently, I had control over every fiber and muscle in my body. I could do anything with my body. I was given what I can only conceive of or understand to be perfect grace.
Wow.
And after that, I slowly made my way down, got the little girl's hat, went back to Meherzad, told the story, gave the little girl the hat. He said, oh, thank you, thank you. Well, I said, don't thank me, thank Baba. And that's the story. Thank you very much.